The arithmetic of survival came down to numbers Sarah Brennan could not bend. November 1888 settled over the Wind River Valley with the weight of inevitability, and she stood in the woodshed behind her cabin counting split pine for the seventh time that week. Each cord represented warmth measured in nights, and the stack against the back wall had shrunk to a height that made her stomach clench. 6 weeks, maybe 7 if she burned slow and slept cold. Winter in Wyoming Territory didn't ask permission. It arrived in late October and held the land until April, sometimes May. That was 20 weeks minimum, often 24. The mathematics were simple and brutal. She was short 10 weeks of fuel, possibly more. There was no margin for error, no cushion against a hard freeze or an early storm. The deficit sat in her mind like a stone. Thomas had always handled the woodpile. He'd spent August and September in the high country, felling lodgepole pine and letting it season before the first snow. He'd stack it 8 feet high and 20 feet long enough to see them through the worst months with wood to spare. But Thomas had been gone since April, taken by typhoid fever in 3 terrible days that left her a widow at 29 with a mortgage she couldn't pay, in a cabin that leaked heat like water through a sieve. She'd tried to cut wood herself in October. The saw blistered her palms raw, and after 4 hours of work, she'd managed 3 logs barely thick enough to burn. The pile was a joke. She'd bought 2 cords from Dutch Keller's general store, spending money she didn't have, and that had brought her to this 6 weeks of fuel for a winter that would last 4 months. The cabin behind her was a single room of chinked logs with a stone hearth and a pine floor Thomas had planed smooth the year they married. It had been enough when he was alive. Now it felt like a trap. Every seam between the logs let wind through. The roof was single-layer shakes that sweated condensation when the temperature dropped. The door didn't fit the frame properly and rattled when the north wind blew. She'd stuffed rags in the gaps. She'd nailed a blanket over the window. It didn't matter. Heat fled the cabin as fast as she could generate it. A good fire in the hearth would warm the room to maybe 65 degrees, but the moment the flames died down, the temperature plummeted. By morning, the water bucket near her bed would have a skin of ice, and the floor was cold enough to sting her feet through wool socks. She had started tracking her fuel consumption in early November, scratching marks on a plank with a nail. One cord lasted 4 days when she kept the fire burning through the night. That was the rate that kept the cabin survivable, barely warm enough to sleep without shivering. If she let the fire go out after dark, she could stretch a cord to 6 days, but she'd wake at dawn, numb and exhausted, her breath fogging the air inside her own home. The numbers didn't change no matter how many times she recalculated them. 6 weeks of wood, 16 weeks of winter. The gap was unbridgeable. She couldn't afford more fuel. Thomas's medical bills and the mortgage payment had taken everything. She had $8 in a tin above the hearth, and Dutch Keller was charging $6 a cord now that demand had spiked. One more cord would buy her 10 days. It wouldn't be enough. Cutting her own wood wasn't possible. The nearest timber was 2 miles up the ridge, and even if she could haul the saw that far, she couldn't fell trees alone. She'd tried. The lodgepole pines were 60 feet tall and required precision to drop without killing herself. And even if she managed that, she'd need to limb them, buck them into rounds, split the rounds, and haul the pieces back through snow that would soon be waist deep. It was work for a strong man with a horse and a full day. She had none of those things. She could ask for help. The thought sat sour in her chest. Joseph Callahan lived a quarter-mile south and had offered to check on her after Thomas died. He was a decent man, a carpenter with rough hands and a careful way of speaking. But asking him to cut her wood for free felt like begging, and she'd already borrowed enough goodwill. The other families in the settlement had their own problems, their own fuel to gather. No one had extra labor to spare on a widow who couldn't pay. Pride didn't warm a room. Prayer didn't split logs. She was going to run out of wood in mid-January, and when that happened, she would freeze. She closed the woodshed door and walked back toward the cabin. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and flat. The air smelled like snow, though none had fallen yet. The grass along the path had gone brittle and yellow. In another week, the ground would be frozen solid. Behind the cabin, maybe 300 yards up the slope, was an outcrop of pale limestone that rose 30 feet above the valley floor. She'd noticed it when they first claimed the land, a blunt shelf of rock that caught the afternoon sun. Thomas had talked about quarrying stone from it for a root cellar, but he'd never gotten around to it. At the base of the outcrop was a shallow recess, not quite a cave, but deeper than a simple overhang. It cut back maybe 12 feet into the hillside and stretched 9 feet wide at the opening. She'd used the space over the summer to store milk. The stone kept things cool even when the days were hot. She'd noticed that the temperature inside stayed remarkably stable, barely shifting between noon and midnight, even when the outside air swung 20 degrees. The rock seemed to absorb the day's heat and hold it, releasing it slowly through the night. It was just an observation at the time. Now it felt like something else. She walked up the slope toward the outcrop, her skirt catching on the dry sage. The ground was hard under her boots, the soil already beginning to lock down for winter. The limestone face rose in layers, sediment compressed over millennia into bands of gray and cream. The recess at its base faced southeast, angled away from the prevailing northwest winds that raked the valley every winter. She stepped inside. The air was cooler than outside, but not cold. It had a stillness to it, an absence of movement that felt almost deliberate. She'd been in here a dozen times over the summer and never thought much of it. Now she stood still and paid attention. The walls were rough limestone, cool to the touch, but not icy. The ceiling was maybe 7 feet high at the entrance, sloping down toward the back where it met the floor in a gentle curve. The floor itself was packed dirt over solid rock level and drawn. There were no cracks in the ceiling, no places where water seeped through. It was just a hollow space, carved by weather and time, unremarkable except for one thing. It held temperature. That was the phrase that formed in her mind. The stone didn't just block wind or shed rain. It absorbed heat and gave it back slowly, the way a griddle stayed warm after you pulled it from the fire. She'd seen that all summer with the milk. A jar left inside would stay cool for days, even when the sun baked the valley. The rock was doing something, some physical process she didn't have a name for. She went back to the cabin and returned with a wool blanket, a candle, and a box of matches. It was late afternoon, the light already going thin and gray. She spread the blanket on the floor of the recess and sat down, her back against the stone wall. She lit the candle and watched the flame. It barely moved. In the cabin, even with the door closed, a candle flame would flicker and dance in the drafts that leaked through the walls. Here it stood, almost perfectly still, a steady teardrop of light. The air wasn't moving. She blew out the candle and sat in the dimness. The stone behind her back was cool, but not unpleasant. The air around her felt neutral, neither warm nor cold. It was different from the cabin, where the temperature was always in flux, always sliding toward whatever the outside air was doing. Here it felt held stable. She stayed until the light faded completely, then walked back down the slope in the dusk. Inside the cabin, she built a small fire, just enough to take the edge off the cold, and sat at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil stub. She wrote down what she knew. The cabin lost heat faster than she could generate it. The rock held heat without fuel. If she slept in the cave, she wouldn't need to burn wood to stay warm overnight. That was half her fuel consumption gone. The idea felt absurd even as she wrote it. People didn't sleep in caves. They slept in houses with doors and windows and roofs. Sleeping in a hole in the ground was something animals did, or prospectors gone mad from isolation. It was undignified. It was strange. It was also the only solution she had. She slept poorly that night, her mind chewing over the logistics. How cold would it actually get in the cave? Was it warm enough to survive without a fire? Or would she just freeze slower? What if snow blocked the entrance? What if the rock shifted and collapsed? The risks felt enormous. The whole plan desperate and half-formed. But the numbers hadn't changed. 6 weeks of wood. 16 weeks of winter. The next morning, she carried a thermometer up to the cave. It was a simple mercury tube Thomas had used for checking the temperature of glue when he was working. She hung it from a nail she'd driven into the limestone just inside the entrance, then went back to the cabin and hung a second thermometer on the porch. She checked both at noon. The outside air was 42 degrees. Eavesbounds. Inside the cave, it was 58. She checked again at midnight. Outside had dropped to 31 degrees. The cave was still 56. She felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but possibility. She didn't build a fire in the hearth that night. She wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and lay in bed watching her breath fog the air. By 3 in the morning, the cabin had dropped to 34 degrees, cold enough that her fingers ached when she tried to flex them. She got up and walked outside in the dark, her boots crunching on frost, and climbed the slope to the cave. The air inside was 58 degrees. She stepped in, and the cold that had been clawing at her skin for hours simply stopped. It wasn't warm, not the way a fire was warm, but it wasn't the vicious, penetrating cold of the cabin. It was neutral, livable. She stood there for a long time, feeling the difference. Then she went back down the slope, gathered her bedroll and a few belongings, and carried them up to the cave. That was the first night she slept in stone instead of wood. The transition wasn't dramatic. She didn't announce it or explain it. She simply stopped sleeping in the cabin. Her bedroll went onto the dirt floor of the cave, elevated slightly on a pallet of scrap pine she'd built to keep it off the ground. Cold air sank and she wanted to sleep above it. She brought a small trunk with her clothes, a lantern, and a tin cup for water. Everything else stayed in the cabin. The cave didn't need much. That was the revelation. In the cabin, she'd been fighting against the cold-burning fuel constantly just to keep the temperature from killing her. In the cave, she wasn't fighting anything. The stone did the work. It absorbed the meager warmth of the day and held it through the night, radiating it back in a slow, steady exchange that kept the air stable. She started experimenting. On the third night, she built a small fire just inside the entrance, a modest pile of kindling and a few split branches. It wasn't the roaring blaze she would have needed in the cabin. It was just enough to warm the stones around it. She let it burn for an hour, then scattered the coals and let the fire die. The heat didn't vanish. The stones she'd arranged in a ring around the fire stayed warm for hours, radiating heat into the space. The limestone walls absorbed it and gave it back slowly. By morning, the cave was 61 degrees warmer than it had been without the fire, and she'd burned maybe a tenth of the wood she would have needed to achieve the same temperature in the cabin. She felt the first flicker of something that might have been hope. She refined the system over the next 2 weeks. She hauled river stones up from the creek, smooth round cobbles the size of her fist, and arranged them in a careful ring just inside the entrance. Each evening, she built a small fire in the center of the ring, feeding it a handful of dry branches and letting it burn until the stones were hot to the touch. Then she'd spread the coals thin and let the fire die, and the stones would release their heat through the night. It was astonishingly efficient. The amount of wood she burned in the cave in a week was less than she'd been burning in the cabin in a single night. Her woodpile stopped shrinking at the terrifying rate it had before. The gap between her fuel supply and the length of winter began to close. She hung a canvas tarp over the entrance, leaving a narrow gap at the top for air to circulate. The tarp blocked the wind, but didn't seal the cave completely. She was careful about that. She'd heard stories of miners who'd sealed themselves into spaces too tight and suffocated on their own breath. The air had to move, just not rush. The system worked. That was the only word for it. The cave stayed between 54 and 62 degrees, regardless of what the outside air was doing. She slept warm. She woke rested. Her body stopped aching from the constant cold, but the settlement noticed. Samuel Hayes saw it first. He was a builder, a man who made his living, understanding how structures worked, and he'd been walking past Sarah's property one morning when he noticed the chimney, or rather the lack of smoke coming from it. It was mid-November. The temperature at dawn was in the low 30s. Every other cabin in the valley had smoke rising from its hearth-thin gray columns that marked where people were burning wood to stay alive. Sarah's chimney was cold. He mentioned it to his wife that evening. Maybe the widow had gone to stay with family. Maybe she'd left the territory entirely. It wasn't his business, but it gnawed at him. A cold hearth in November meant something was wrong. 2 days later, Dutch Keller saw Sarah walking out of the cave at dawn. He had been up early checking his trap line and had taken a route that cut behind her property. He saw the tarp hanging over the entrance to the limestone recess, saw her push it aside and step out into the gray morning light, her breath fogging the air. He stopped walking. For a moment, he thought he had seen wrong, that the light was playing tricks. But no, she'd come out of the rock. She was living in the rock. He didn't say anything to her. He went straight to the general store and told the first 3 customers who came in. By noon, the story was all over the settlement. The widow Brennan was sleeping in a cave, living like an animal, alone in the stone with the winter coming on. The reaction was immediate and uniform. People thought she'd lost her mind. Grief did strange things. Everyone knew that. A woman who'd lost her husband might do irrational things, make poor decisions, retreat from the world. That was understandable. But this was something else. This was choosing to live in conditions worse than the poorest homesteader abandoning a perfectly good cabin for a hole in the ground. The word spread quickly. By the end of the week, everyone within 5 miles knew. The widow who sewed shirts and mended dresses was sleeping in a cave like a prospector or a hermit. It was sad. It was troubling. It was proof that she'd been broken by Thomas's death and hadn't recovered. The talk was mostly quiet at first. People didn't want to be cruel, but the worry was real. What if she froze? What if the rock collapsed? What if she was starving herself, too proud or too mad to ask for help? Mary Hayes brought it up one afternoon while Sarah was hemming a skirt she'd brought in for repair. They were standing in Sarah's cabins, hearth cold, the air inside barely warmer than outside. People are talking. Mary's voice was soft, careful. She was a woman who chose her words the way her husband chose timber, looking for the grain that wouldn't split. Sarah kept her needle moving. She didn't look up. I know. They're worried about you. I'm fine. Mary hesitated. She glanced around the cabin, noting the unused hearth, the stack of firewood against the wall that didn't seem to be shrinking. Are you still sleeping out there in the cave? I am. Sarah. Mary's voice carried a weight now, a gentle pressure. That's not safe. What if the weather turns? What if you get trapped? Sarah set the skirt down and met Mary's eyes. Her expression was calm, not defensive. I'm warm. That's all that matters. But you have a house. You don't need to. The house doesn't hold heat. I burn a cord of wood every 4 days just to keep it above freezing. The cave stays warm without any fire at all. I'm using 1/10 of the fuel and sleeping warmer than I have in months. Mary stared at her. The logic was too strange to process immediately. But it's a cave. It's stone, the cabin isn't. There was a long silence. Mary looked at the cold hearth, at the unused wood, at Sarah's steady hands and clear eyes. She wasn't frail. She wasn't desperate. She looked healthier than she had in weeks. How much wood are you burning? Mary asked slowly. Maybe 3 sticks a night, just enough to warm the stones. Mary did the math in her head. Her own family was going through a cord every 5 days and they were rationing carefully. 3 sticks a night was nothing. It was impossible. I don't understand. Mary's voice was quieter now, uncertain. Sarah picked up the skirt again. The rock does the work. I just give it a little help. Mary left without saying more, but the conversation stayed with her. That evening, she told her husband what Sarah had said. Samuel listened, then shook his head. Doesn't make sense. Stone's just stone. It can't make heat. She says it holds heat. From where she's not burning anything. She burns a little, just a few sticks. Samuel snorted. That wouldn't warm a doghouse. But the seed was planted, and despite his dismissal, he found himself paying attention over the next few days. Sarah's chimney stayed cold. The wood pile outside her cabin didn't shrink. She walked through the settlement like always took in sewing work paid for her groceries. She didn't look cold. She didn't look desperate. She looked fine. The dissonance gnawed at him. Either she was lying or something about the cave was doing what she claimed. And Samuel Hayes was a man who understood structures, who knew that materials behaved in specific ways. Stone was dense. It absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. It was possible barely that a sheltered space lined with limestone could hold temperature better than a drafty log cabin. But that would mean a woman living in a hole in the ground was warmer and safer than families in proper houses. And that thought was too unsettling to accept. So the settlement waited for winter to prove them right. Sarah didn't care what they thought. That was the truth of it. She'd spent the first week after Thomas died caring very much what people thought, worrying about appearances and propriety, and whether she was grieving correctly. It had been exhausting and pointless. She refined her system through late November. She added a second layer of canvas over the entrance with a 6-inch gap between the two sheets. The dead air space insulated better than a single layer. She built a low partition of stacked stones just inside the entrance to block direct wind without cutting off airflow completely. She laid flat stones along the ceiling to catch rising heat and reflect it back down. Each small change made the space more stable. The temperature swings narrowed. On nights when the outside air dropped into the teens, the cave held steady at 56 degrees. On nights when she burned her small fire, it climbed to 62 and stayed there until morning. She kept records. Every morning she checked the thermometer and scratched the temperature onto a pine board with a nail. She tracked the outside temperature, the cave temperature, and the amount of wood she burned. The pattern was consistent and undeniable. The cave was warmer, safer, and required a fraction of the fuel. By early December, her wood pile had barely moved. She calculated that at her current rate of consumption, she had enough fuel to last through March with wood to spare. The crisis that had felt insurmountable in October was solved, but the solution had made her an outcast. No one asked her to sew anymore. The work dried up gradually, orders not placed, projects delayed. People were polite when she came into Dutch Keller's store, but the conversations were brief and uncomfortable. She could feel their pity and confusion, the way they looked at her like she was something broken that needed fixing. She stopped trying to explain. So she kept quiet and focused on what mattered. She was warm, she had enough fuel, she would survive the winter. The weather turned colder in mid-December. The first serious snow fell on the 18th 4 inches that covered the valley in silence. The temperature dropped into the single digits at night. Sarah watched her neighbors' chimneys billow smoke-thick columns that meant they were burning hard just to stay ahead of the cold. Her own fire was a handful of sticks, a small, bright core that heated the ring of river stones and nothing more. She let it burn for an hour, then scattered the coals and went to sleep. The cave stayed at 58 degrees all night. She woke warm for the first time in years. December 23rd brought a cold snap that sent the temperature to 8 below zero. Sarah heard later that the Hayes family had burned through half a cord in 2 days trying to keep their cabin above freezing. Their children slept 3 to a bed under every blanket they owned and still woke shivering. Sarah slept alone under a single wool blanket and woke comfortable. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore, but the settlement still wasn't ready to see it. On Christmas Eve, Joseph Callahan stopped by the cabin. He knocked, got no answer, and walked around to the back. He saw the tarp over the cave entrance and hesitated. Then he called out, "Mrs. Brennan, you in there?" Sarah pushed the canvas aside and stepped out. She was wearing a wool dress and a shawl, her hair pinned back. She looked at him calmly. "Joseph, Merry Christmas." He looked past her at the cave entrance, at the dim glow of a lantern inside. His expression was complicated, concern, mixed with something that might have been embarrassment. "Just wanted to check on you, make sure you're all right." "I'm fine. It's Christmas Eve. You shouldn't be alone. I'm not bothered by it." He shifted his weight. The cold was biting and his breath came out in clouds. "You know people are worried, talking." "I know. Mary said you're sleeping out here, in the cave." "I am. That's not, Sarah, that's not normal." She almost smiled. "Normal doesn't keep you warm, Joseph." He didn't know what to say to that. He stood there in the cold, looking at this woman who'd lost her husband and her security and somehow landed on a solution so strange that no one knew how to respond to it. She didn't look crazy. She looked clear-headed and calm. "If you need anything," he said finally, "anything at all, you just ask." "I will, thank you." He nodded and walked back down the slope, his boots crunching through the snow. Sarah watched him go, then stepped back into the cave and let the canvas fall close behind her. The lantern light made the limestone walls glow faintly warm tones of cream and gray. The air was still and neutral, the temperature holding steady at 59 degrees. Outside, the wind was picking up a low moan that rattled through the valley. Inside the cave, it was just a distant sound, muted and harmless. She sat on her bedroll and pulled the blanket around her shoulders. The stones from the evening fire were still warm, radiating heat she could feel on her skin. It wasn't the fierce blast of a hearth fire, but it was enough. It was exactly enough. She thought about Joseph's visit, about the worry in his voice. They couldn't understand because they hadn't done the math. They were locked into the idea that survival looked a certain way: four walls, a roof, a fire burning day and night. They couldn't see past that to the simple physics underneath. She lay down and pulled the blanket to her chin. The cave around her was silent, except for the faint whisper of her own breathing. No wind howling through gaps in the walls, no draft stealing warmth from her skin, just stone and stillness, and the patient, reliable exchange of heat through mass. She closed her eyes and felt something close to contentment. Outside, the settlement hunkered down for the worst of winter, burning through their wood piles at a desperate rate, praying the cold wouldn't last too long. Inside her cave, Sarah Brennan slept warm on a fraction of the fuel, solving the problem they all faced with nothing but observation and willingness to be thought strange. The winter was just beginning, and she was ready. January 6, 1889. The barometric pressure began dropping at dawn, a shift so gradual that most people in the Wind River Valley wouldn't have noticed it without an instrument. Sarah had no barometer, but she'd learned to read other signs. The clouds came in low and fast from the northwest, a solid deck of gray that pressed down on the ridgeline. The air turned dense and still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. Birds that had been working the frozen creek bottom disappeared, gone to shelter in the dense brush. The light took on a peculiar quality, flat and colorless, as if the sun had given up trying to penetrate the atmosphere. She'd seen weather like this before. Once in childhood, once the winter after she married Thomas. Both times had brought storms that lasted days and buried the valley under snow measured in feet rather than inches. The settlement didn't have a name for this kind of storm. They just called it bad weather and hoped it wouldn't come. Sarah spent the morning hauling extra firewood up to the cave, small branches and kindling she could burn in controlled amounts. She filled her water jug from the creek before the cold could lock it down. She checked the canvas tarps, reinforcing the ties that held them against the limestone. She moved through the preparations methodically, without panic, the way Thomas had taught her to approach any task that mattered. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. By evening, it was in the low 20s and still falling. The wind picked up after dark, not the steady blow that usually came down the valley, but something erratic and fierce, gusting hard enough to shake the canvas and make the whole structure of her shelter shudder. She built her small fire inside the ring of stones and fed it carefully, watching the flames lick across the river rocks until they glowed with retained heat. Then she banked the coals and spread them thin, letting the fire die while the stones continued to radiate warmth into the enclosed space. The cave temperature held at 60 degrees. Outside, the wind was beginning to howl. She slept fitfully that night, waking every few hours to the sound of the storm building. By 3 in the morning, the wind was constant, a sustained roar punctuated by gusts that hit like fists. She could hear it tearing through the valley, stripping anything loose and hurling it into the darkness. The canvas over the entrance snapped and flexed, but held. When dawn came, the snow had already started. Not the gentle flakes that drifted down on calm days, but hard pellets of ice-laden snow that came at an angle, driven by wind that had climbed past 40 miles an hour. Visibility dropped to nothing. The world beyond the cave entrance was a wall of white chaos. Sarah stayed inside and waited. There was nothing else to do. Going out in conditions like this was suicide. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, it was lethal. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Getting disoriented and lost was easy, and once you were lost, you died. She had water, she had food, she had heat. The cave was a fortress against the storm. She settled in to wait it out. The temperature outside plummeted. By noon on the 9th, it was 12 degrees above zero. By evening, it was 6. By midnight, it had crossed below zero and kept dropping. The wind screamed across the exposed ridgeline and funneled down into the valley, driving the wind chill to levels that turned breath to ice and froze exposed water in seconds. Inside the cave, Sarah monitored the thermometer she'd hung near the entrance. 58 degrees. The stone was doing exactly what it had done every other night, absorbing the meager heat from her evening fire and releasing it in a slow, steady exchange that kept the air stable. The storm outside was irrelevant to the physics inside. The mass of limestone surrounding her was simply too large and too dense to be affected by short-term temperature swings. She burned 4 small sticks that night, the same amount she'd been burning since December. The stones heated the cave temperature climbed to 61, and she slept under a single blanket without shivering. 300 yards away in the cabin, she'd abandoned the temperature inside had dropped to 28 degrees, despite the fact that no one had opened a door or broken a window. The cold simply leaked through every seam and joint, unstoppable and indifferent. Across the settlement, families huddled around their hearths and burned wood at a rate that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. The Hayes family fed their fire every 2 hours through the night, stuffing split pine into the hearth until the flames roared. Their cabin stayed at 38 degrees. The children slept in the same bed, bodies pressed together for warmth, and still woke with frost in their hair. Dutch Keller broke up an old chair on the second night of the storm and fed it to his fire piece by piece. The flames consumed the seasoned oak hungrily and gave back a few hours of bearable warmth before dying down again. He didn't have enough wood to maintain the fire at that intensity. No one did. They'd all calculated their fuel needs based on normal winters, and this wasn't normal. By the third day, the storm had settled into a grinding persistence. The snow didn't let up. The wind didn't ease. The temperature stayed locked below zero, dropping to -12 at night and barely climbing to -6 during the day. The sun was somewhere above the clouds, but its light was diffuse and gray, offering no warmth at all. People stopped going outside except when absolutely necessary. The snow had piled into drifts 8 feet high against the north walls of every structure. Paths between buildings had to be dug out every morning and were filled again by evening. The effort of staying alive consumed every waking hour. 2 of the oldest residents in the settlement, a man named Matthys, who lived alone near the creek, and a widow named Kowalski who'd come west with her son's family, died on the 4th night. The cold found them in their sleep. Their fires had burned down to coals, and neither had the strength to get up and add more wood. Hypothermia took them quietly, their bodies simply giving up the fight to generate heat in an environment that was stealing it faster than they could produce it. The news spread slowly past from cabin to cabin when people dared to venture out. The deaths were acknowledged with grim acceptance. Winter killed people. Everyone knew that. You did your best to prepare, and sometimes your best wasn't enough. The settlement would bury them when the ground thawed. In her cave, Sarah heard about the deaths on the 6th day when Mary Hayes made the dangerous trek up the slope to check on her. Mary was bundled in every piece of wool she owned, her face wrapped in a scarf that had frozen stiff from her breath. She looked exhausted, her eyes ringed with dark circles. Sarah pulled the canvas aside and let her in. Mary stepped into the cave and stopped her body going still as the temperature registered. After the brutal cold outside, 60 degrees felt like walking into summer. My God. Mary's voice was muffled by the scarf, but the shock was clear. Sarah unwrapped the scarf from Mary's face and guided her to sit on the wooden platform. Stay for a bit. Get warm. Mary sat and didn't speak for a long time. She was shaking not from cold now, but from the sudden absence of it. Her body didn't know how to adjust. She looked around the cave, taking in the lantern light, reflecting off limestone, the small pile of unburned firewood stacked near the entrance, the thermometer hanging from its nail. How is this possible? Mary's words came out slow, disbelieving. The stone. It absorbs heat during the day and releases it at night. But Mary gestured vaguely at the world outside. It's 20 below zero. The wind is, we can't keep our cabin above freezing, even with the fire going all day and all night. We're burning wood faster than we can carry it in. The children are getting sick. Everyone is getting sick. Sarah handed her a tin cup of water. It wasn't frozen. Mary stared at it. We're running out of wood. Mary's voice cracked slightly. Samuel says we have maybe another week if we're careful. After that, she didn't finish the sentence. How much are you burning? 4 cords since the storm started. Maybe more. I've lost track. Sarah had burned less than a quarter cord in the same time period. She didn't say that out loud. The numbers spoke for themselves. Mary took a sip of water and closed her eyes. For a moment, she just sat there, absorbing warmth she hadn't felt in days. Then she looked at Sarah directly. Show me. Show me how you do this. Sarah walked her through it. The ring of stones that absorbed and radiated heat. The canvas layers that blocked wind while allowing air circulation. The elevated sleeping platform that kept her above the coldest air. The small, controlled fires that heated the massive stone around her rather than trying to heat empty air. Mary listened and asked questions. How big should the stones be? How far apart? How much wood actually burned in a night? Where did the smoke go? Sarah answered each question with specifics, measurements, observations. There was no mystery to it. The system worked because stone had mass and mass stored heat. That was the whole mechanism. When Mary finally left 2 hours later, she carried information instead of just worry. She stumbled down the slope through thigh-deep snow, fighting her way back to her cabin, where her husband and children were huddled around a fire that ate wood and gave back barely enough warmth to survive. That night, Mary repeated everything Sarah had told her. Samuel listened with his jaw tight, his pride grinding against the implications. A woman living in a hole in the ground had figured out something that none of the men in the settlement, including him, had understood. It was humiliating. It was also undeniable. Maybe it works because the cave is small. Samuel's voice had an edge to it. You can't heat a whole house that way. She's not heating anything. The stone is doing it. She barely burns any wood at all. That's not possible. Mary looked at her husband at the fire-consuming logs at a rate they couldn't sustain, at their children pressed together under blankets that weren't enough. I was there, Samuel. I felt it. 60 degrees without even trying. And she's been there since November. Samuel didn't answer. He fed another log into the fire and watched it catch. The storm continued. January 10th, 11th, 12th. The snow kept falling not as heavily as the first days, but steady enough to add inches every night. The temperature refused to climb. -8, -15. One morning it hit -23 and stayed there for 18 hours. The settlement was fracturing under the strain. Families that had planned carefully were running out of fuel. Families that hadn't planned were facing catastrophe. People began dismantling furniture, burning anything that would fit in a firebox. Some started eyeing the log walls of their own cabins, calculating how long they could survive if they started feeding the structure itself to the flames. Joseph Callahan lay awake on the night of the 13th, listening to his wife's labored breathing and his children's fitful sleep. They'd burned through 3 cords in 10 days. He had maybe half a cord left, and the storm showed no signs of breaking. They would run out of wood before they ran out of winter. He thought about Sarah Brennan, about the cold chimney in the cave and the rumors that had seemed so strange back in November. He thought about Mary Hayes coming back from that visit, looking shaken and talking about impossible temperatures. He thought about the fact that Sarah hadn't asked anyone for wood or help or anything else since the storm began. At dawn on the 14th, when the wind finally dropped to something manageable, he put on his heaviest coat and fought his way through the snow to Sarah's property. The drifts were waist-high in places, and the effort left him breathing hard and sweating under his layers. Sweat was dangerous in this cold. It would freeze against his skin and make everything worse. He reached the limestone outcrop and stood at the base looking at the canvas tarp that covered the cave entrance. There was a thin wisp of smoke coming from the cave at the top, barely visible. Nothing like the thick columns pouring from every other chimney in the valley. He called out, "This is Brennan. It's Joseph Callahan." The canvas moved and Sarah appeared. She looked at him calmly, no surprise on her face. "Come in, you'll freeze standing out there." He ducked under the canvas and straightened up inside the cave. The change in temperature was instant and shocking. After 10 days of grinding cold that never relented, stepping into air that didn't bite felt like a hallucination. He stood very still, his mind trying to reconcile what his body was telling him. It was warm. Not roaring fire warm, but warm enough that his face stopped aching and his hands stopped cramping. Warm enough to live. How the word came out rough. Sarah gestured at the cave around them. "The stone. I don't fight the cold. I just let the rock do what it does." Joseph walked deeper into the space, his carpenter's eye taking in the details. The ring of river stones near the entrance, their surfaces still faintly warm from the previous night's fire. The canvas layers creating dead airspace. The wooden platform raising the bedding above the floor. The flat stones arranged along the ceiling to catch and reflect heat downward. He saw the thermometer hanging from its nail. 59 degrees. Outside was -11. "How much wood are you burning?" "3 or 4 small pieces a night. Maybe a tenth of a cord since the storm started." Joseph had burned 4 full cords in the same period. His family was still cold. His children were developing coughs from sleeping in temperatures that hovered just above freezing. His wife's feet had sores from standing on floors that never warmed up, no matter how much fuel they fed the fire. And this woman, living alone in a limestone hollow, was comfortable. He felt something complex and uncomfortable shifting in his chest. Not quite anger, not quite shame. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that everything he thought he understood about shelter and survival had been wrong. Jesus. The word came out as an exhale, barely audible. Sarah's voice was quiet behind him. Physics. He turned to look at her. She was standing with her arms crossed, her expression neutral. Not smug, not apologetic. She'd solved a problem and the solution worked. That was all there was to it. "Can I tell people about this?" "You can tell whoever you want. I'm not hiding anything." Joseph nodded slowly. He stood there for another minute, absorbing the reality of the space. Then he ducked back out into the brutal cold and made his way down the slope, moving slowly through the snow, his mind racing. By evening, he'd told 6 people what he'd seen. By the next morning, those 6 people had told 20 more. The information spread through the settlement like a shockwave, colliding with skepticism and denial and desperate hope. Most people didn't believe it at first. 60 degrees in a cave during the worst cold snap in living memory. Using almost no wood. It sounded like a fever dream, the kind of delusion that came from hypothermia. But Joseph Callahan wasn't a man given to exaggeration or fantasy. He was practical, careful, honest. If he said the cave was warm, it was warm. Samuel Hayes heard about Joseph's visit from 3 different sources within 6 hours. Each version of the story was slightly different in detail, but consistent in the core fact. Sarah's cave was holding temperature that shouldn't be possible with the amount of fuel she was burning. His pride wanted to reject it outright, but his family was suffering, and he couldn't afford pride that cost his children their health. On the morning of the 16th, he strapped on his boots and made the walk to Sarah's property, carrying a thermometer of his own. She let him in without comment. He didn't ask permission, just held up his thermometer and hung it from a different nail away from hers. Then he stood and waited, watching the mercury climb. 54 degrees. His thermometer agreed with hers. Outside was -6. The differential was 60 degrees. 60 degrees of warmth that wasn't coming from a roaring fire or massive fuel consumption. It was just there, held in the mass of stone and released in a patient, reliable cycle. Samuel touched the limestone wall. It was cool to his palm, but not cold, not frozen. The stone had absorbed heat from the small fire Sarah burned each evening, and it was giving that heat back now, hours later, in a steady, radiant exchange. He pulled his hand away and looked at her. "How did you figure this out?" "I didn't figure anything out. I just paid attention. The milk stayed cool in here during summer. The temperature didn't swing like it did outside. That's just how rock works." Why didn't anyone else see it? Because everyone else was too busy doing what they've always done, building cabins, burning logs, fighting the cold instead of working with it. Samuel felt the words land like an accusation, even though her tone carried no judgment. He'd built half the cabins in this valley. He'd done it the way his father had taught him, the way everyone knew how to do it. 4 walls, a roof, a hearth. That was shelter. That was how you survived winter. Except it wasn't. Not efficiently, not sustainably. He'd been building structures that required massive amounts of fuel to maintain livable temperatures, and the whole time there was a better way sitting in plain sight. "Show me how you set up the stones." His voice was flat, stripped of the defensiveness that had been there earlier. Sarah showed him. The size of the stones, the spacing, the height of the ring. How she built the fire small and let it burn until the rocks were hot but not glowing. How she scattered the coals to extinguish the flames while the stones continued to radiate. How the heat traveled through the rock and into the surrounding limestone, creating a thermal reservoir that released warmth for hours. Samuel asked questions and Sarah answered them. When he finally left almost 2 hours later, he didn't say thank you. He didn't apologize for doubting her. He just nodded once and walked back down the slope into the cold. But that evening he started moving stones. He hauled river rocks up from the frozen creek, round cobbles the size of his fist, and arranged them in a ring inside his cabin near the hearth. He built a fire the way Sarah had described, small and controlled, and let it heat the stones before letting it die down. The stones stayed warm through the night. Not as warm as Sarah's because the cabin didn't have the thermal mass of limestone surrounding it, but warmer than empty air. His family burned half the wood they had been burning the previous night and slept at the same temperature. The word continued to spread. By the 18th, the storm had been going for 9 days and the settlement was running on fumes. People who'd started the winter with adequate fuel were now rationing down to dangerous levels. Some families had already started burning furniture and scrap lumber, anything combustible they could find. And then they heard about the cave, about Sarah Brennan sleeping warm on a fraction of the wood they were consuming, about Joseph Callahan and Samuel Hayes both confirming it independently, about the simple physics of thermal mass. Skepticism started crumbling under the weight of evidence. People who'd called Sarah strange or pitied her for living in a hole now began asking different questions. How big did the stones need to be? How many could you do this in a cabin, or did it only work in a cave? Could you modify an existing structure, or did you need to start from scratch? Sarah answered every question the same way. She didn't know all the answers. She'd figured out what worked for her through trial and observation. Mass mattered. Air needed to circulate but not rush. Small fires heating thermal mass worked better than large fires heating empty space. The rest was just details. On January 19th, the storm finally began to break. The wind eased. The temperature climbed to 0, then 5 above, then 12. The snow stopped falling. The clouds started to fracture, letting through thin shafts of sunlight that looked pale and strange after days of gray. People emerged from their cabins, blinking and exhausted. The settlement looked like it had been through a war. Snow was piled everywhere, drifts covering fences and outbuildings. Paths between structures were narrow trenches carved through white walls. Wood piles that had been 8 feet high 10 days ago were down to scattered pieces. The toll was visible in faces and bodies. Everyone looked thinner, more drawn. Children had dark circles under their eyes. Adults moved slowly, conserving energy they couldn't afford to waste. 2 people had died. Others had come close, saved only by luck or the intervention of neighbors who'd shared their dwindling fuel. Sarah emerged from her cave looking rested and healthy. She'd used 1 quart of wood total since November. Her pile of fuel was still substantial enough to see her through the rest of winter with plenty to spare. She hadn't suffered. She hadn't struggled. She'd simply adapted to the environment instead of fighting it. The contrast was impossible to ignore now. The storm had stripped away all the rationalizations and excuses. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Sarah had survived the worst weather in living memory more comfortably than anyone else in the valley, using less than a quarter of the resources. People stopped calling her strange. They started calling her smart. The shift happened without announcement or apology. It was just a quiet recalibration of social standing based on demonstrated competence. The woman who'd been pitied and worried over in December was now being sought out for advice in January. The shelter that had seemed like the refuge of someone broken was now recognized as the solution to a problem that had nearly killed them all. Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't remind anyone of their earlier doubt. She just continued doing what she'd been doing, refining her system, staying warm, surviving. When people came to ask questions, she answered. When they asked for help designing their own modifications, she offered what she could. But the real change wasn't in how people treated her. It was in how they thought about shelter itself. The storm had taught them that tradition wasn't the same as wisdom, that the way things had always been done wasn't necessarily the best way, that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem was sitting in plain sight waiting for someone desperate or observant enough to see it. The temperature stabilized over the next few days, climbing to the 20s during the day and dropping to the teens at night, still cold but survivable. The immediate crisis was over. People began digging out, assessing damage, counting their remaining fuel. Dutch Keller had 4 days of wood left. The Hayes family had maybe a week if they were careful. Half a dozen families were in similar situations, their calculations from October having been overwhelmed by the severity of the storm. They'd all planned for a normal winter. This hadn't been normal. But now they had information they hadn't had before. They had proof that thermal mass could reduce fuel consumption by 75% or more. They had a working example of a shelter that defied every assumption they'd held about what survival required. Some started making changes immediately. Dutch Keller excavated deeper into his root cellar, expanding it into a proper underground space lined with stone. He moved his sleeping area down into it and found that the temperature underground stayed 15 degrees warmer than his cabin with no fire at all. Others began planning modifications for next year. Samuel Hayes started sketching designs for cabins with thick stone walls around the hearth walls that would absorb heat during the day and release it at night. He showed the drawings to clients who were thinking about building in the spring, explaining how thermal mass could reduce their fuel needs permanently. Joseph Callahan moved his children's beds into a dugout space behind his cabin, a shallow excavation backed by earth and stone. The kids slept warmer there than they ever had in the main house. His fuel consumption dropped by half almost immediately. The changes rippled outward, quiet but persistent. People who'd spent their whole lives accepting that winter meant burning massive amounts of wood and still being cold began to question that assumption. If Sarah could stay warm on 4 sticks a night, why couldn't they? On the 23rd of January, a week after the storm broke, Reverend William Tucker came to see Sarah. He was the settlement's spiritual leader, an older man with silver hair and a careful way of speaking. He'd been educated back east and carried himself with the dignity of someone who'd seen more of the world than most people in the valley ever would. He stood at the entrance to the cave and asked permission to enter. Sarah nodded and stepped aside. He ducked under the canvas and straightened up inside, looking around with open curiosity. "I've been hearing stories." His voice was measured, thoughtful. "Joseph Callahan says it's 60 degrees in here without a fire. Samuel Hayes confirmed it with his own thermometer. Mary Hayes says you've been living like this since November." "All of that's true." Tucker walked slowly around the space, examining the ring of stones, the canvas layers, the wooden platform. He touched the limestone wall, feeling the slight warmth radiating from it. "This is remarkable. Do you understand what you've discovered?" I haven't discovered anything. That's been true since before there were people. But you're the one who applied it. You saw a solution that no one else saw. Sarah shook her head slightly. I saw a problem I couldn't solve any other way. I didn't have enough wood. I needed to find shelter that didn't require fuel I didn't have. The cave was just the answer. Tucker was quiet for a moment, thinking. People have been saying you were troubled. Living out here like this, they thought grief had made you irrational. I know what they thought. They were wrong. Yes, Tucker smiled faintly. You're not going to make them apologize, are you? What would be the point? They survived? I survived. That's what matters. The Reverend nodded slowly. I'm going to say something from the pulpit this Sunday about humility and observation, about the difference between tradition and wisdom. I won't mention you by name if you don't want me to. Say whatever you think is right. Tucker left a few minutes later, walking carefully down the snow-covered slope. That Sunday, he stood in front of the small congregation and talked about pride and learning, about how the people who survived best weren't always the ones who followed the rules, but the ones who paid attention to what actually worked. He didn't name Sarah, but everyone knew who he was talking about. The settlement's attitude continued to shift through the rest of January. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real. Sarah had been proven right not through argument, but through results. She'd survived the worst storm in generations more comfortably than anyone using a fraction of the resources. That was evidence that couldn't be argued with. February brought cold, but not the sustained brutality of early January. The temperature fluctuated between 10 and 30 degrees, manageable for people who still had fuel. But the memory of the storm lingered. Everyone knew how close they'd come to real catastrophe. Everyone knew that without the information Sarah had provided through Joseph and Samuel and Mary, more people would have died. The question now wasn't whether her method worked. The question was how to implement it more broadly. How to take the principles she discovered and apply them to existing structures, to new buildings, to the entire approach to frontier survival. Sarah didn't have all those answers. She'd solved one problem for one person in one specific situation, scaling it up, adapting it to different contexts that would take more work and more minds. But she'd proven the concept. Mass matters more than insulation. Small fires heating thermal reservoirs work better than large fires heating empty air. Those principles were sound, and now people were paying attention. The changes came without fanfare or formal declaration. Dutch Keller started first on a gray morning in late February, when the ground was still frozen solid. He took a shovel to the root cellar behind his store and began digging, not just widening the space, but deepening it, carving 6 feet further into the hillside. The work was brutal. Every foot of progress required chipping through frozen earth and hauling out rocks embedded in clay. He worked alone, not explaining himself to anyone, just methodically expanding the underground space. By the second week of March, he had lined the walls with river stones pulled from the creek bed. Heavy, rounded cobbles the size of bread loaves, stacked without mortar, in rough courses that followed the contour of the excavation. He installed a small iron stove near the threshold, the kind miners used in their claims, barely large enough to burn more than kindling. When the next cold snap came through, he moved his bedroll down into that space. The temperature underground held at 53 degrees without any fire. When he lit the stove for an hour before sleep, burning nothing but twigs and scraps, the space climbed to 58 and stayed there until morning. He burned 1/5 of what he'd been consuming in the store's back room. His children stopped coughing. His wife stopped complaining about her feet being numb all night. He didn't announce what he'd done. People just noticed that the smoke from his chimney had thinned to almost nothing, and when they asked, he showed them the excavation without elaboration. Stone and earth. That was the whole secret. Samuel Hayes approached the problem differently. He had clients who wanted new cabins built come spring, families who'd claimed land over the winter, and needed structures ready before the next cold season. He'd always built the same way his father taught him: log walls chinked with mud and moss, shake roofs, stone hearths, positioned against an outer wall for easier chimney construction. Now he sat at his table sketching variations. What if the hearth wasn't against the outer wall but set into an interior wall, 18 inches thick, built entirely of stone from foundation to ceiling? The mass would absorb heat all day as the fire burned, then radiate it back through the night. The exterior walls could be thinner, lighter, because they weren't doing the primary work of heat retention anymore. That was the stone's job. He showed the drawings to the Kowalski family who'd lost the elderly widow in the January storm and wanted a better house for the surviving members. They looked at the sketches with skepticism that gradually shifted to interest as Samuel explained the thermal principles. Thick stone core, fire heats the mass releases heat slowly, less fuel, more stable temperature. They agreed to let him try it. By April, he was laying the foundation, and by June, the house was framed. The central stone wall rose like a spine through the middle of the structure, a dense thermal battery that would hold summer heat through cool nights and winter fire warmth through the coldest snaps. Samuel stood back when it was finished and felt something close to pride, not in his craftsmanship, but in the adaptation. He'd learned to build differently because the old way had proven insufficient. Joseph Callahan's modification was simpler, but no less effective. He dug a sleeping chamber into the hillside behind his cabin, an L-shaped excavation that extended 8 feet back and 6 feet wide. The walls were packed earth reinforced with timber, the ceiling low enough that he had to duck when entering. 3 walls of the space were surrounded by undisturbed soil insulated by the earth's own mass. His family slept there through the remainder of winter and found the temperature never dropped below 48 degrees even when the outside air plunged below zero again in late February. They burned wood only for cooking, now not for overnight heat. The children's health improved. The constant tension of rationing fuel eased. By March 7, families within a 15-mile radius had made similar changes. Not identical implementations, but variations on the same principle. Use mass to store heat. Let stone and earth do the work that wood couldn't sustain. Stop fighting the environment and start working with its physics. No one called it the Brennan method. They just called it practical. Sarah watched the transformations from a distance, continuing her own routine without commentary. She sewed garments for people who brought her work again, the orders returning as quietly as they'd stopped. The payments came with a new undertone of respect, an acknowledgement that she'd been right about something important, even if no one wanted to say it directly. She used the money carefully. By early March, she had $87 saved, more than she'd had since Thomas died. The mortgage on the old cabin was still outstanding, a debt that shadowed every decision she made about the future. The cabin itself sat empty now, a shell she had no use for, but couldn't afford to abandon, while it still carried financial obligation. On March 23rd, she made a decision that surprised the settlement one more time. She approached the banker in the county seat, a man named Morrison, who held the note on her property, and offered to sell the cabin outright. The structure, the land it sat on, everything except the limestone outcrop and the 2 acres surrounding it. She wanted to buy that parcel separately and use the sale of the cabin to clear the debt. Morrison looked at her with the careful neutrality bankers used when evaluating risk. The cabin's not worth much, logs and shakes, maybe $60 if someone wants it for the materials. Then take $60 off the debt and give me a new note for the outcrop land, $40 to buy it clear. He did the arithmetic in his ledger. The original mortgage had been $140. She'd paid $18 before Thomas died. That left $122 outstanding. If the cabin covered $60 and she paid $40 cash for the outcrop parcel, she'd still owe $22 on the original note. You'd be trading a house for a pile of rocks. Morrison's tone suggested he thought she was making a poor choice. The rocks kept me alive. The house didn't. He couldn't argue with that. The story of the January storm had reached even the county seat, carried by travelers and traders who passed through. The widow who'd survived in a cave while others froze in proper houses. It had become a cautionary tale about preparation and adaptation. Morrison drew up the paperwork. By the end of the day, Sarah owned 2 acres of hillside and limestone outright and owed $22 on a note that gave her 2 years to pay. The cabin would be dismantled by a family that needed the logs for their own construction. Sarah didn't care what happened to it. The structure had failed her when it mattered most. What mattered was the stone. With the land secured, she began planning something more permanent. Not just sleeping in a natural recess, but building a hybrid structure that combined the thermal benefits of underground space with the livability of above-ground construction. She sketched ideas on scraps of paper, working through the geometry and the material requirements. The design took shape slowly. The back portion would extend 8 feet into the hillside, excavated and reinforced, surrounded on 3 sides by limestone and earth. That was the thermal core, the space that would hold stable temperature year-round. The front portion would be timber-framed, a small room with south-facing windows to capture winter sunlight. The two sections would connect seamlessly, sharing warmth between them. She couldn't build it alone. The excavation required more strength than she had, and the timber framing needed skills she didn't possess. She approached Joseph Callahan and Samuel Hayes separately, asking if they'd be willing to work in exchange for detailed documentation of the design. She wanted to pay them, but her cash was limited. What she could offer instead was information, specifications they could use for other projects. Both men agreed without hesitation. Joseph because he believed in what she was doing. Samuel because he saw the professional value in understanding the system fully. They started work in early April, as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig. The excavation took 3 weeks. They carved into the hillside behind the original cave, expanding the footprint and creating a level floor 8 feet deep into the slope. The back wall and 2 sides were solid bedrock limestone that had been there for millions of years and would be there for millions more. The ceiling was reinforced with timber beams and covered with planks, then backfilled with 2 feet of earth for insulation. The front structure went up faster. Samuel framed it in pine simple post and beam construction with wide windows facing south. The walls were single-layer logs thinner than a typical cabin because they didn't need to bear the full insulation load. That was the earth and stone's job. The wood just needed to block wind and shed rain. Inside, Sarah designed the space with precision. The sleeping area was in the back, surrounded by thermal mass. The living area was in the front, where sunlight could enter and provide passive heating during the day. Between them, she built a stone wall around a small hearth, not for constant burning, but for occasional fires that would heat the rock and extend the warmth through the entire structure. The whole design was oriented around efficiency: capture free heat from the sun when available, store it in mass, release it slowly, use fire sparingly only to supplement what the environment provided naturally. It was shelter as a system, not just a box to keep out weather. The work finished in late May. Sarah moved her belongings from the cave into the new structure and spent the first night in a space that felt both underground and open to the sky, both ancient and entirely new. The temperature inside was 64 degrees without any fire at all. The spring air outside was 52. The differential wasn't as dramatic as winter, but the principle was proven. The structure worked year-round, moderating temperature in both directions. It would stay cool in summer and warm in winter, requiring minimal intervention to remain livable. It was exactly what she'd envisioned. Word spread through the settlement and beyond. People came to see what she'd built, not out of curiosity anymore, but as a kind of pilgrimage. They wanted to understand how someone with limited resources had created something that outperformed structures built with far more labor and material. They wanted to learn. Sarah showed them everything: the depth of the excavation, the thickness of the earth cover, the positioning of the windows, the size and placement of the thermal mass. She answered questions with the same directness she always had, offering information without pretense. She hadn't invented anything. She just paid attention to how materials behaved and designed accordingly. By the summer of 1889, the settlement had begun to transform in ways that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. New construction incorporated stone walls and earth berms. Existing cabins were modified with root cellars, expanded into living spaces. People talked about heat in terms of thermal mass and storage rather than just the height of the flames in their hearth. The shift was practical rather than philosophical. No one was interested in theory. They were interested in results. Sarah had demonstrated that it was possible to live comfortably through a brutal winter on a fraction of the fuel everyone else required. That was valuable information, information worth acting on. Dutch Keller started stocking larger quantities of river stones in his store, selling them by the bushel to people who wanted to build heat retention systems. Samuel Hayes found himself explaining thermal mass principles to every client who hired him. Joseph Callahan taught his children how to select and arrange stones for maximum heat transfer, passing on knowledge that hadn't existed in the valley a year before. The changes rippled outward beyond the immediate settlement. Travelers carried stories of the innovative shelters in the Wind River Valley to other communities. Some dismissed it as frontier eccentricity. Others paid attention and began experimenting with their own variations. A man from Lander rode out in July to see Sarah's house and spent 3 hours taking notes. He was building a trading post at a mountain pass and wanted to minimize fuel costs in a location where wood was scarce. Sarah walked him through the entire design, explaining not just what she'd built, but why each element mattered. He left with sketches and measurements and a clear understanding of the principles. In August, a family passing through on their way to a mining claim stopped specifically to ask about underground construction. They'd heard the story of the January storm and wanted to build something that wouldn't kill them if they got trapped by weather. Sarah gave them the same information she'd given everyone else. Dig deep, use stone, let mass do the work. She didn't charge for the consultations. Money wasn't the point. The point was that people were learning to survive more effectively, and that knowledge would spread naturally if she didn't try to control it. Information wanted to be used. Trying to hoard it would just slow the adaptation she'd started. By autumn, Sarah had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable for the first time since Thomas died. She took in sewing work that paid enough to cover her needs. She tended a small garden on the south side of her property, vegetables that grew well in the short Wyoming season. She maintained her structure, making small refinements as she discovered what worked and what needed adjustment. The approaching winter didn't bring anxiety this time. She had fuel stockpiled enough to last through even a severe season. She had shelter that required almost no heating to remain livable. She had food stored and water access. She was prepared not through desperate last-minute calculations, but through systematic planning based on proven methods. The settlement around her had changed as well. People who'd started the previous winter with barely adequate preparation now had fuel reserves and modified shelters. They'd learned from the storm, and more importantly, they'd learned from Sarah's example. The knowledge had spread until it was no longer remarkable or controversial, or just part of how people approached the problem of surviving in an environment that didn't care whether they lived or died. October came with its first frosts. November brought snow. December brought cold that tested the new systems people had built. But this time the settlement didn't fracture under the strain. Chimneys produced less smoke. Wood piles depleted slower. No one was burning furniture. No one was dismantling their own walls to stay alive. Sarah tracked her fuel consumption through the winter of 1889 to 1890 and found she was using roughly the same amount as the year before. 3 to 4 small sticks per night, occasional larger fires when the temperature dropped into the extreme ranges. Total consumption for the entire season was under 1 cord. Her neighbors, even with their modifications, were using 3 to 4 cords. But that was still a dramatic improvement over the previous year's consumption. The difference was sustainability. At 3 to 4 cords per winter, a family could reasonably plan and provide their own fuel. They weren't dependent on purchasing wood or gambling that the weather wouldn't exceed their worst-case scenarios. They had margin. They had resilience. In February, a journalist from Cheyenne came through the territory doing a story on frontier innovation. Someone had told him about the thermal shelters in the Wind River Valley, and he wanted to see them for himself. He spent a day interviewing people and taking notes, then came to Sarah's property last. She showed him the structure without embellishment. He asked about her background, her education, where she'd learned the engineering principles. She told him she hadn't learned them anywhere. She'd needed a solution and observed her way to one. But you changed how people think about shelter. The journalist was looking for a bigger narrative, something about feminine ingenuity or frontier determination. I changed how I survived. Other people saw that it worked and made their own changes. That's just common sense, not revolution. He wrote the story anyway. It appeared in the Cheyenne newspaper in March of 1890 under the headline Widow's Cave Shelters Settlement. The article was factual, but framed the story as a triumph of individual resourcefulness over hardship. Sarah read it when someone brought her a copy and felt uncomfortable with the characterization. She hadn't triumphed over anything. She just refused to die quietly. The article brought more visitors. Some were genuinely interested in the technical details. Others wanted to meet the woman from the story as if she were a curiosity to be observed rather than a person who had solved a practical problem. Sarah tolerated the attention with the same neutral patience she brought to everything else. By spring of 1890, the principles she demonstrated had spread to 3 neighboring counties, not because she'd evangelized or promoted them, but because people who'd seen the results shared the information with others who needed it. The knowledge moved through social networks carried by traders and travelers and families who'd implemented the changes themselves. A territorial surveyor came through in April and noted the unusual construction patterns in his report. Thermal mass walls, underground extensions, earth-sheltered roofs. He documented it as a regional adaptation to harsh winters, an example of frontier communities learning to work with their environment rather than simply imposing traditional Eastern building styles that didn't fit the conditions. Sarah continued refining her own shelter through 1890 and into 1891. She added a second layer of earth cover over the excavated portion, increasing the insulation depth to 3 feet. She installed a small cistern that collected roof runoff, giving her water access without having to walk to the creek in winter. She built a covered work area on the south side where she could sew or do other tasks while benefiting from direct sunlight. Each modification made the structure more livable and more efficient. She was learning through iteration the way Thomas had taught her to approach any long-term project. Build something that works. Use it. Notice what could be better. Adjust. Repeat. The settlement around her continued to evolve. By 1891, 14 new structures had been built incorporating thermal mass principles to varying degrees. Existing cabins had been modified until they barely resembled their original forms, their simple log boxes transformed into hybrid systems that used stone and earth as much as wood. Samuel Hayes found himself building fewer traditional cabins and more experimental designs. Each client wanted something slightly different adapted to their specific site and needs. He'd gone from being a builder who followed established patterns to something closer to an engineer solving problems through material selection and spatial arrangement, rather than just following the template his father had taught him. Joseph Callahan discovered he had a talent for underground construction. He understood how to shore up excavations, how to prevent water infiltration, how to create spaces that felt secure rather than claustrophobic. He hired himself out to families across the region who wanted to add earth-sheltered components to their properties. The economy of the valley shifted subtly. Less money flowed to wood suppliers. More money went to stonemasons and excavation labor. The change wasn't dramatic enough to destroy anyone's livelihood, but it was noticeable. The settlement was adapting not just in how they built, but in how they allocated resources. Dutch Keller stopped selling firewood entirely and focused on hardware and supplies. He stocked more tools for stonework, more canvas for wind barriers, more metal stoves designed for minimal fuel consumption. He recognized that the market had changed and adjusted his inventory accordingly. The winter of 1891 to 1892 was mild compared to the storm year, but even so, the improved shelters made a difference. People burned less wood than they had in any year previous. They slept warmer with less effort. The constant grinding anxiety of fuel rationing had eased across the entire settlement. Sarah lived through that winter in quiet comfort, her fuel consumption still under accord for the season. She was 32 years old now, 3 years past Thomas's death, no longer defined primarily by widowhood, but by the knowledge she'd accumulated and shared. People sought her advice not because she was extraordinary, but because she'd paid attention when it mattered and was willing to explain what she'd learned. In the spring of 1892, the territorial government sent an assessor to evaluate property values in the region. He noted Sarah's structure in his records with some confusion. It wasn't quite a house in the traditional sense, and it wasn't quite a dugout. It was something in between, a hybrid form that didn't fit his categories. He estimated its value at $45 based on the materials and labor, not understanding that its real value was in the fuel it didn't require and the comfort it provided with minimal intervention. Sarah didn't care about the assessment. She owned the land free and clear now, having paid off the remaining debt in 1891 with money saved from sewing and occasional consultation fees. The structure was hers, and more importantly, it worked. That was the only measure that mattered. Years passed. The innovations that had seemed radical in 1889 became standard practice by the mid-1890s. New families moving into the region were advised to build with thermal mass as a primary consideration. The phrase itself entered common usage in the territory, people talking about thermal performance, the way they talked about roof pitch or foundation depth. Sarah aged into the role of elder without seeking it. People came to her property not just to see the structure, but to ask for advice on their own building projects. She gave what help she could, always emphasizing that she wasn't an expert, just someone who'd observed carefully and acted on what she learned. In 1895, a young couple building on a claim 12 miles away asked her to consult on their design. She spent an afternoon walking their land, noting the sun angles and the prevailing winds and the available materials. She sketched a layout that used a natural depression in the hillside as the starting point, embedding the structure into the landscape rather than imposing it on top. They built according to her suggestions and found that their first winter required less fuel than they'd stockpiled for emergencies. By 1900, Sarah had lived in her hybrid shelter for 9 years. The structure had weathered storms and seasons without significant deterioration. The stone and earth components required almost no maintenance. The timber elements needed occasional repair, but nothing major. It was a design built for longevity, not through expensive materials, but through working with the natural stability of mass and geology. The settlement around her had grown and stabilized. The population had increased as more families claimed land in the territory, but the approach to shelter had fundamentally changed from what it had been before the winter of 1888 to 1889. The storm had forced a reckoning with traditional methods, and Sarah's solution had provided an alternative path forward. She lived quietly through the next 2 decades, sewing and consulting and maintaining her small garden. She never remarried, not because she was opposed to it, but because she'd built a life that didn't require partnership to be sustainable. She was independent in a way that frontier life rarely allowed, particularly for women. But she'd earned that independence through solving a problem no one else had been willing to approach differently. Thomas came to her mind less frequently as the years passed, not from fading love, but from the simple progression of time. She remembered him in flashes now, his hands working wood, his patient explanations of how materials behaved, his quiet confidence that problems had solutions if you looked hard enough. She'd taken those lessons and applied them after he was gone, and they'd kept her alive when nothing else would have. In 1910, a young man from the Territorial University came to interview her for a project about frontier architecture. He wanted to document the thermal shelter designs that had emerged in the Wind River Valley and trace their development. Sarah talked with him for several hours, explaining the principles as she understood them and showing him the structure that had started everything. "Do you think you changed the settlement?" The young man's question was earnest, looking for historical significance. Sarah thought about it carefully. "I think the storm changed the settlement. I just showed people one way to survive it. They did the rest themselves. But without your example, someone else would have figured it out eventually. That's not secret knowledge, it's just physics." The young man left with notes and photographs, disappointed perhaps that she wouldn't claim more credit for what had happened. But Sarah had never been interested in credit. She'd been interested in not freezing to death, and she'd found a solution that worked. Everything else was just consequence. She lived in her hybrid shelter until 1923, 44 years after Thomas died, and 34 years after the storm that had forced her to innovate. She was 64 years old when pneumonia took her in late spring, her lungs finally giving out after decades of breathing cold air and working in conditions that would have killed most people sooner. The settlement buried her on her own land near the limestone outcrop that had saved her life and indirectly saved dozens of others. The structure she'd built remained standing solid and functional, requiring no occupant to prove its worth. It simply existed, a demonstration that shelter could be designed around physics rather than tradition, efficiency rather than convention. In the years after her death, the house changed hands several times, occupied by people who appreciated its unusual qualities but didn't fully understand its significance. By the 1940s, it had become something of a historical curiosity, a structure that predated modern understanding of passive solar design and thermal mass construction, but somehow anticipated those principles through pure observation and necessity. The county eventually acquired the property and maintained it as a historical site, not because Sarah Brennan had been famous, but because her solution to an immediate crisis had influenced an entire region's approach to shelter. The cave where she'd first slept in 1888 was still there behind the hybrid structure, unchanged and still maintaining its stable temperature of 55 degrees year-round without any human intervention. Engineers who studied the site in later decades marveled at the elegant simplicity of the design. No complex systems, no expensive materials, just stone and earth and careful attention to how heat moved through mass. It was frontier engineering at its most essential, solving problems with available resources and borrowed principles from the natural world. The story outlived the woman. People forgot Sarah's name, but remembered the concept. Thermal mass, earth shelter, passive solar gain. The vocabulary changed over time, became more technical, more formalized. But the core idea remained the same. Work with the environment instead of fighting it. Let physics do the heavy work. Sarah had never claimed to invent anything. She just refused to accept that the only way to survive winter was the way everyone else was doing it. And in that refusal, in that willingness to be thought strange or broken or foolish, she discovered something that was neither strange nor foolish at all. It was just true. And truth doesn't care whether anyone believes it. It just waits to be discovered by anyone desperate enough or observant enough to see it.